Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Andrew. Whilst taking a break from my Agile software design series, I've been doing a few videos instead on DesiGen, my design and code generation tool. In this video, we're going to have a look at building CSLA 6 apps using DesiGen. This video is a tutorial in which I'm going to walk through the process of building an application using the new templates for CSLA 6. A member of the CSLA community has asked that we build a part of the sample application used to demonstrate CSLA's capabilities, namely Project Tracker. We will only do a small part of the application today, but it will be enough to show the process and how to do it in DesiGen. This will not be dissimilar to the demonstrations on animal management, except that this is slightly more to the object graph for Project Tracker. This graph has a child collection, which animal management doesn't. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, here we are on the home screen of DesiGen. What we're going to do is we're going to create a brand new design. Now, when you start for the first time, you'll have to create a system, but I already have some systems set up, so I'm going to just create it in the demos project, in demos system, sorry. And we'll have a name for our design of Project Tracker. What we're going to build is Project Tracker. So that can be our requirements. We're going to do project edit, the object graph associated with that. So we're going to need two data structures this time. And the first one is going to be project. And I'm going to use one of the built-in templates just to get me started, although I will change most of what it does. So the naming convention that Rocky uses doesn't include the table name in the parameters, in the field properties. So we can take that off and go to the simpler naming convention. And there's a value in doing that because you can hit a problem. We will run into a problem by doing this because we've changed the naming convention. There's one bit of the generated code which is guesswork, and it won't work, and we'll see why later. So we're going to need a description field, and that's not specified as to how big it is, but I'm going to say it's 1,000, but that it's optional. We're also going to need a field called started, and that's a date time and is optional. And we're going to need ended. That's also a date time and is optional. We'll have to do some work associated with it being optional later. Now, the other thing that's in this table is a timestamp. I'm going to leave the timestamp out. The reason is that automatically by ticking the include audit fields checkbox on the edit data structure page, which is checked by default, I get auditing from the templates automatically all the way through wired up so that I don't need to do anything. Now, if you were using EF Core, then using a timestamp field as is shown in the Project Tracker sample makes sense, but I'm just going to leave that bit out today. You'll have to forgive me just leaving that bit for simplicity. So that's project. The other thing we need is assignment. And any old template will do for this, really. Now, this doesn't seem to have like a primary key. I think it has a composite key in Rocky's implementation, which is fine. You could do that, but I'm just going to save a bit of time by doing something else, just putting an ID on it. Now, this field is mostly integer values, so it's got a project ID. It's got a resource ID, which is the resource or the person. The object has a first name and last name, but they don't go in the assignment table, so I'm going to leave those out. It's also got a role ID, which is the role that the person is fulfilling within the project, I think. And it's also got assigned. Unlike the other one, although this is a date time, there can't be an entry in the assignment table unless it's assigned, so I'm going to mark that as required. Now again, I'm leaving out the timestamp as I've explained. I just will draw your attention to why I used a data structure template for this. There's a thing called field sets, and the field sets include setting up the primary key. You can do that all from scratch, but it just saved me a moment in not having to. So that's my data structures done, assignment and project. So now we need to do our artifacts. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a complete solution, and because the templates that I have that are ready for doing it are Blazor, I'm going to do that. I'm going to use Blazor Server rather than Blazor WebAssembly. It just saves a few clicks as we get towards the end, but either would work. So we'll just use the Blazor Server solution using CSLA, and that's in the V6 folder under CSLA Solutions, and that's the new bit in this version of DesiGen. So we need a solution name. I'm going to use Project Tracker. And I'm going to put it CTemp Demo Project Tracker. I can mostly click through all of the add artifact kind of confirmation steps. I want everything here, and there's pretty much nothing to set up. We'll see as we go through, but we're just creating the projects we need here. That will look fine. So there's nothing else to do there. That's our solution shell. It doesn't do anything, but it's all of the projects that we need for the next step. So the next step is to create the objects that we need. So Project Edit is an editable route, and we will also need a way to, just for the time being, we'll need a way to list what editable objects exist, and so I'll need a read-only root list and a read-only child as well. So again, as we've seen elsewhere in DesiGen, what it then does is it tells me what this batch that I'm about to work on contains and asks me where I want to put it. So the objects, the editable root, the read-only root list, and the read-only child objects are going to go in the objects project, and they are based on the project data structure. As we create them, we've got to do different authorization rules here, because that's a part of the requirements, if you like. So a project manager and an administrator can fetch a project edit. A project manager can create a new one and edit an existing one, and I think only an administrator can delete one, although that's not what my piece of paper says, but I think that's what we need to do. So we've updated the authorization rules there that were available to us. The other thing we need to do is type in the name of the type that will go underneath us in the object graph, or the types, plural. If there are multiple children, we would do a comma separated list. As it is, there's only one, and the type is called project resources. Project list needs to be loadable by, I guess, project manager These are plural, the way that the project tracker sample application is done. I would normally do plural, but the role name is singular in the sample, so I'll follow that. There are no children of the read-only list. We just use the read-only list just to see what projects there are, so we're not going to put anything underneath that. So that's our the sort of top level of our graph. We've done project edit. What we need to do now is we need to do the children bit as well. So for that, we're going to need an editable child list and an editable child. Now, project resources and project resource edit are actually customized children. They're not your regular children. I'm sort of going to ignore that bit just for speed, otherwise this video will get too long. But what you'll find is that what we create would sort of work, but then you've got extra work to do in order to actually achieve what Project Tracker does. So where are we going to put our child objects? We're going to put them in the same project as we put the root one, but this time we're using the data structure of assignment. The name for this needs changing because it's sort of a peculiarity. Something that Rocky has chosen to do is to show that it's not all, very simple. CSLA is capable of much more than just one-to-one mappings between tables and object types, and as a result of that, the names are different from the underlying table because there's a sort of multiple different ways into doing assignments from what I remember. A child type name is project resource edit. Looks okay. And the child is called, as I just mentioned, project resource edit. And the type that is above the collection we need to enter so that it knows how to access it, and that is going to be a project edit. And there are no children of this, it doesn't go down another level. So that's those done. So that's our object model added to our design. We could have put notes about customizing project resources and project resource edit. I didn't do that, but that would be part of a proper design if I was going to go, the whole hog. So the next thing we need to worry about is data access. So what we need is some .NET 6 data access. We're going to use stored procedures for this because that's what I've been asked to do. As it happens, that's what the templates do by default. So that is nice and easy to do. So we're going to use under .NET 6 Transact SQL repository using stored procedures, all SQL objects, interface and DTO. So it's going to ask me where I want to put the repository interface, the contract that repositories have to fulfill. So like before with animal management, if you watch me do that, I put it in a data contracts folder within the objects project, and that's very much on purpose. And that is because I want to enforce that the data access project can't be referenced by the objects project accidentally. We enforce it by requiring it the other way up. So I'm going to do project first. The repository implementation, this is like the data access code, so it's going to go in the data access folder, and that's based on project. The stored procedures are going to go in the stored procedures folder underneath the data storage project, again based on project. The SQL table will go in the tables folder in the data storage project and be based on the project data structure. So we create our repository interface and our DTO. For our repository implementation, we need to enter the database name. let's use project tracker for the database name. For the stored procedures, we're just going to create all of those because we need all of them for a root object. We don't need one of them for a child object, although in fact I'm actually going to add it anyway. So that's project edit related data access, all the project DAL bit. So in CSLA terms they call it a DAL. I tend to use the word repository because that's the pattern that I think it really fits. So we need to do the data access related stuff for assignment. It's going to get, again, ask me where the repository interface and DTO need to go. So they're contracts, so they go in the data contracts folder, but we're using assignment as our data structure this time. The implementation is going to go in the data access project and use assignment. Store procedures, same place as before, based on assignment, and the table in the table folder based on assignment. Going to leave the name of this. The repository should probably be called the same thing as the underlying table, so I'm not going to rename this one. And we need to enter the database name again. Project tracker. So when we load a child collection, what we do is we call the list fetch store procedure. So we would definitely need that one. You don't need the individual assignment store procedure because you don't use it for a child collection. However, as I mentioned earlier, the project, the object model is a bit more complicated than the just being a child associated with assignment. So there's other stuff that goes on. So I'm just going to create it anyway in case it's useful at a later stage. We could always delete it afterwards, but we will need all the others: insert, update and delete. You would always need those. And the table gets created as you would expect. So that's added those to our design. So we've done our object model and we've done all the data accessy bits underneath it. What we haven't got anything of is user interface to be able to test any of it. So that's what we'll do next. We'll scroll down under UI Blazor CSLA 6. We've got a new 6 folder. We're going to use manage list and edit components, view model and MS tests. So we're going to use MVVM. Now I am deviating here away from Project Tracker, probably. I didn't actually look at how the user interface is done. There are lots of user interfaces in Project Tracker, and I'm not necessarily going to do all of the user interface stuff within this tutorial. What I was actually asked to do was the object model and the data access layer, and so I'm going to create a bit of user interface just to show that that's actually working by the time we've finished. So manage list and edit components, view model and MS tests. Where do I want to create my Blazor components? So I'm going to put these in the components folder in the Web UI project, which is the Blazor server project. We could split them out into a Razor component library. That might be a nice thing to do. I haven't done that. These are going to be based on project. The view model is going to go into the UI control project and again be based on the project data structure. And our tests go in our unit tests project based upon project. So we need to change the authorization of this little lot. So we want project manager and administrator to have access to the project area in general. There would be some specialization of what buttons are available to people, which again I'm not going to do because I'm not really going to do much of the user interface stuff. But we know that project manager, administrator probably need to get into this area to do the subset that they're allowed to do. Okay, so the editable type name should be project edit. That's what we created it as. and the child is going to be project info. This is our list component that's asking this question, and our edit component needs to know the view model name, but I've left that as default. And the manage, the top level, have a look at the way I do the user interface once you've followed the tutorial through. Basically, I use a manager component to switch between the list and the editable, or the multiple editables associated with an object graph. That's just so that you don't have to do things like passing parameters via the URL. Now in Project Tracker that would probably be fine, because Project Tracker I don't think is multi-tenant, but in lots of real-world situations these days, like software as a service type systems that you might be building, in multi-tenanted type systems where you've got like subsets of users that should only be able to access their own stuff, accepting parameters off the URL means that you've then got to be a bit more careful about whether the user has asked for an ID that they're allowed access to. So what I tend to do is make it more difficult for them to get to that. It's not that I won't authorize it, but I'll just make it more difficult by not putting it on a query string that might be visible to people. So our unit test also needs one little bit of specialization, which is telling it that we used a custom name for the editable type, project edit. What the view model tests are going to do is they're going to access the factories sort of directly. These factories are nested within the objects themselves in the way I'm generating at the moment. That doesn't have to be the case for you. You can change your templates and do something else, but that's just the way I've chosen to do it, because that means I don't have to change the scope of any criteria objects I create, because they're nested sort of at the same level within something else. So that's the user interface artifacts all added. So we've done kind of throughout the stack there, we've done some UI bits, we've done the object model stuff, which we did first, and we've done the sort of data accessy stuff at the bottom. So that's all the artifacts we need. Not going to add any references to this design. For authentication, I'm just going to add some kind of demo-based text. You can put in here whatever you want. But I have a bit of text that I use for demos to explain that the authentication stuff is not fully formed. It's a fake system which allows us to do some basic testing without actually having to do logins and things. So authorization would work and does work, except that it's sort of hard-coded against the authentication system, basically. So the authorization stuff works, but the authentication thing is fake. And so to test authorization, we need to change the hard-coded bit in the authentication fake system. So risk declarations, I'm going to do the usual 2 risk declarations here. First one is authentication bypass. So by creating this demo type application with these templates, there is no proper authentication, and we ought to state that as a risk. And I'm going to acknowledge that it is a risk and accept it, because this is acceptable for a demo. Now, when you install the system, you won't have this thing at the bottom for demos. You can create it by going into the settings menu and adding a potential mitigation to this risk, or you can just not tick anything at the bottom of this list, press accept, and then type something in the mitigation description box. That's your other option. So the other one I'm going to do is insufficient exception handling. Insufficient logging and monitoring is also valid, really, but the exception handling bit sort of wraps both of those up together. And again, I'm just going to accept, acknowledge it and accept it in my case. Again, you might have to put some text there if you want to put these things in. Now, in previous walkthroughs, what I've done is I've added a third one, which was about protecting the CSLA data portal. Now, the good news is that that stuff is now built in. It's built into my template, and that is possible because it's built into CSLA itself. So CSLA 5.5.3 had it as well as CSLA 6. So we don't have to worry about that one anymore. So security categorization. Excuse me. So I think this is a low risk task in the sense that what I'm doing here is a demo, and I will just delete all the code and the database once I've finished. So I'm going to put a piece of text in just to explain that. You can put in whatever minimal stuff you feel is appropriate. Data retention policy, similarly, I'm not going to worry about how things get deleted at this stage. If you were doing this in the real world and not doing a demo, what you might say for your data retention policy is, it's not been defined yet, but here's the task reference for the task that I've created to remind me to do it at some point in the future. Because remember, there are two reasons for doing data retention stuff. One of them is personally identifiable information. So in Europe, we have a thing called GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, which requires us to justify and protect customer information, personally identifiable information of any individual, any living individual, in fact, to be very specific. So we have to be able to justify how long we keep it for and what happens to it when we no longer need it. So that's a pretty good reason for doing data retention. However, it's not the only one, because if we build systems without thinking about how data will ever come out, eventually that system will have been so heavily used because we've been so successful that all the electrons in the universe will have been used up and written into our database, and the system will fall over. So it is always worth considering at some point during the system's lifetime how you're going to get transactional data, the amount of data that increases over time. How are you going to get that out of the system again? Is there a point at which it becomes no longer necessary to keep it? And if so, what do you do about getting rid of it at that point? So that's what data retention is about. You don't have to do data retention straight away, but it is always worth asking whether you should create a task to remind you to do it at a later point. Because you don't need to delete data on day one of a system going live, probably, but you will probably need to consider it later on. So with our data retention policy completed, our design is done. At this point, what we can do is we can create a design document if this is useful to us. We could store this on the network. That is a record of the decisions that we made. There are a couple of reasons for doing that, really. So GDPR requires us to be able to evidence that we thought about security, we thought about personally identifiable information and that kind of thing. So for GDPR, this is quite useful if you ever get audited. If you work for a business that gets audited for other reasons, any other reasons really, to do with security practices and that kind of thing, this document is also excellent for that, because you can say that you follow this process and you can evidence it by having the document. You can print it out, give it to them, or email it to them, or wave it in front of them without giving it to them, because it does contain some potentially sensitive information about how your system's built. So it may be something that you don't want to share with everyone, but it's there for you to do. But the other reason for creating it really is, it might be that down the road you decide that DesiGen isn't the solution for you, and that there's some other way of doing design or code generation which is better, in which case you can just delete it all. And if you've got the documents external to the system, you're not tied into that, keeping that system at all. There's no sort of engagement requirement that you have to keep the system because it's got historical stuff in. You just create the document, stick it on the network, or in OneDrive, or whatever your chosen location of documentation is, and then DesiGen is unimportant to you if you choose that it's not very useful. So this gets created in a temp folder basically, so you would save it to a more suitable location, and then that's done with the document. So you can see that the generate code button is not enabled. That's why it's a slightly different color to the others. The description above explains that it's because of the status that the design is currently in. There's a little bit of workflow that is available to you if it's useful. So you could have your designs reviewed by another member of the team, so you can discuss whether this is a good solution to the problem at hand. This is a demo, so we don't need to do that. So what I'm going to do is click Update Status to change it to Ready to Develop. I'm going to bypass the review type stages, but they're there for you in case you want them. And the reason you would do that is that on the Open a Design screen, you can filter by status. And so if there's only one thing that's at a status of to be reviewed, it's much easier for someone else to find it without having to know exactly what you called your design and all that kind of stuff. They just go into the system, they choose requires review or whatever the status is in order to find the one that they need to work on. So that workflow stuff is sort of there. There's not very much to it, but it's there in case you need it. But now we're ready to generate. So we press the Generate Code button, and quite quickly it will generate all the bits that we need in order to do the Project Tracker sample. So we can switch over to Visual Studio. Visual Studio I have already started, and it was in the right folder so that I would get my solution available to me quite quickly, so you don't have to look at me perusing my hard disk. Again, like I've done with a few other demos, rather than doing the quick start stuff, this solution asked me questions at the beginning, if you remember, of what my projects were going to be called. Because I don't know what they're going to be called, I can't have them in the solution to begin with. So I now need to add them. So I right click on the solution and say Add Existing Projects. And I'm going to start by adding the Web UI. The Web UI is the Blazor server project. The only reason I add that one first is that that becomes the startup project because it's the first one into the solution. You don't have to do that. You could add them in whatever order you want and then just right click on Web UI and make it your startup project. There we add everything that we've got in here, basically. Data access, data storage. You can put these within solution folders if you find that useful. With Blazor Server, there's no sort of client to server separation, so I don't tend to do it quite so much, but it's up to you. What I will do, however, while I remember, is I will create a solution folder for the tests, just to get those out of the way. I'm not really going to show you making the tests work. It's not particularly complicated. You just need to create a fake repository and sort out some namespaces, basically. You can do mocking. I've chosen just for my templates to indicate a fake instead. So in case that nomenclature doesn't mean much to you, a mock generally I think of as something that is created for you by a mocking framework, so you don't have to write it by hand, whereas a fake is something that you create. That is the naming convention that is suggested by a guy called Roy Osherove in his testing book, which I read and appreciated. He seems to be good on unit testing, so that's what I do. So we added data storage. It took a moment longer than some of the others because it's a .NET Framework project. And so it needs to spin up a few bits in Visual Studio that aren't used for the others. It's a different type of project in that it doesn't use the new SDK style project format. So we've got a little bit of fixing to do to that project when we get there. But we've added our objects. Tests I'll come back to because I want to put them in the folder. So UI control is the one that's left. And then into the tests folder, I'm going to add the UI control test project. And more or less not worry about that one. So all of our projects are now in our solution, but they exist in splendid isolation. They don't know about one another. Again, because I didn't know, I give people the option of choosing the names for their projects if they don't like the naming convention that the template suggests by default. I don't know what they're going to be called, and so I can't do the cross-project dependencies automatically for you in these templates. Now you can create templates. If you have a naming convention and you choose it up front, you can create templates that do this bit for you as well. It's just that I can't do that. So the unit tests, as I say, I'm not going to worry about them too much, but I will just show you what needs to be referenced. So the unit tests would need to reference the objects project, sort of. You don't actually need objects, but I tend to add it. Most important is referencing UI control. Those are the two dependencies you need there. Now, data access, remember data access is the reference is upside down. What we do is we reference the objects project from the data access implementation. And the reason we do that is to stop anyone accidentally doing the reference the other way up and wiring us to a sort of a single implementation when there may be multiple. So that's why we do it that way up. Data storage doesn't reference anything else. It's just a sort of standalone thing. The objects project also doesn't reference anything. UI control needs to reference the object library. And our sort of hosting Blazor server needs to bring in data access so that it's available when we run. And it also needs to access the UI control layer, because this is where the Razor components are within Blazor server. Again, you don't need to add the objects reference, but I tend to, because it is used, but it would be a transitive dependency via UI control, so you don't absolutely have to add it. Okay, so that's all of our projects that know about one another. The problem is the code within the solution doesn't know that. So if we look at our repositories, we'll find that they don't know the namespace in which our data access contracts have been defined. So we need to add that. And we do that to each of the repositories. You could do this using a global usings, of course, in CSLA 6. That might be a nice kind of solution to this problem. I haven't gone so far in these templates to do that yet, but that would mean that you'd only need to do it once, which might be quite nice. So you can consider doing that. So the same is true of our view model, that our view model will need to know where other stuff is, in particular our business objects, because it makes use of those. So we add that. We add that reference, and it looks like I made a bit of a boob. So when I added the artifacts to the design, it looks like I called the top level object in the graph project instead of project edit. That's okay, we can recover from that problem. That is not a problem at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete project. I'm going to go back to DesiGen, and this will show you, I've done this entirely accidentally, but it will show you something that might be useful to you. So what DesiGen does is it remembers what's been generated. And by default, things will only get generated once, but we can change that behavior. So if we go back into our design, you could create a new version based upon this design, and it carries across the information about whether things have been replicated. I'm just going to do it in this one rather than create a new version. What I should have done was change this name to Project Edit. I did talk about it in all of the other places, but it looks like I forgot to do it here because I was too worried about authorization changes, which I knew I needed to do. So if I change that within the design, then that would get generated the next time we run, except for the fact that I forgot to change the behavior. Generation behavior here, look, is set to only once. That's what it defaults to, because if it's set to anything else, there's a risk you would accidentally overwrite customizations you make to the code that you've generated, which obviously would be a bit of a pain in the arse for you. So I don't want that to happen to you, so I default it to only once, but you can change it. What I'm going to change it to is regenerate once. What that means is that the next time I run generation, that artifact will be regenerated for me, and then the regeneration process will change that drop down back to only once, so that it only happens the next time I do it and not after that. So if I jump to processing and press generate code again, what that will do is just generate project edit. That's the one thing that I told it to regenerate. Now when I go back to Visual Studio, my object is called project edit instead, and that fixes the problem with the code that I'd spotted in the view model. So that's good. So now we should be at a point where we switch to the task list. The task list is a window in Visual Studio. I don't know if anything exists like this in Visual Studio Code, but if it doesn't, just do a search for to do, this to do colon, which is what makes things show up in the task list. This is going to give me reminders of things that I might need to do to the code. So the first thing is in Project Edit, do I need to add any complex business rules? The answer to this is probably yes. I seem to remember that Project Edit is supposed to have more complicated business rules, but for the moment, just to keep the tutorial within the bounds of a sensible length of time, I'm not going to add those, but I am going to delete the comment that takes me there so that I know that I've dealt with it. Object authorization rules. Now we set the authorization the way we want it at the class level. So we've done who can get an existing project edit, who can create one, who can edit one, and who can delete one. There are also, if you look at the sample code, there are per property authorization rules as well. Again, in the interest of brevity, I'm not going to do those today, but you would add these. This is all standard CSLA stuff. This is nothing to do with the way DesiGen works, because now we're actually at the point more or less where we're into CSLA world. Not quite. We've just got a couple more things to do. So the next one is, do we need to default any values for any of the objects that we're working with? In Project Edit, at the moment, I'm going to say no, we don't. I'm just going to leave everything at its default values, I think. That should be fine. Project List, again, is just reminding me, do I need to do anything more complex with the authorization rules? As far as I know, I don't. There might be something about the way that you access Project Edit in Project Tracker. I didn't actually look, to be fair. So Project Resource Edit, this has a whole load of customization in it, which I'm not going to do in this tutorial. So I'm just going to get rid of that reminder as well. Per property authorization rules, similarly, there might be some, and I don't think there are on Project Resource Edit, because I think it's only available to a subset of users anyway at the higher level sort of thing, but I'm not absolutely sure, but I'm just ignoring that bit. Again, that's regular CSLA stuff rather than being about DesiGen, so it doesn't really need to be part of this tutorial. Same thing, Project Resource Edit, we could default values. The one value that it might be worth defaulting is the assigned property. So when you create an assignment, it is automatically assigned, isn't it? So we could do that. I'm going to set the assigned property to datetime.now. That might be useful. Now, I'm not going to run any code that actually makes use of this, but that's just an example of why that that reminder exists in the task list. Okay, within a child object, we need to specify when that object is saved, what parent it's associated with. Now, my recollection is that Project Resources doesn't create things in quite the same way you might imagine. So this probably is a bit of code that wouldn't be used, but I'm not absolutely sure. So I'm going to do it anyway. And this will be project ID property. And I would set that from the parent project ID. Oh, it's called ID, isn't it? because of our naming convention. And then we can delete the reminder that we need to do that. That will also exist in the update. So it exists as a reminder in the update just in case those values are editable. Now this is perhaps to do with the fact that it's got a compound key in Project Tracker. I think it might have a compound key and I'm not sure. Does that matter? I don't think that matters. So I don't think you can change the project that an assignment is associated with. So I don't think this would ever change. But again, the reminder is there in case you're using something which isn't an identifier assigned by the database, and it's like a user specified piece of information that can change. So if you can move objects, child objects between parents, that sort of thing. So that's why that reminder is there. It's rare to do it in update. You always have to do it in insert, almost always. But it's rare to do it in update. So the next three, I'll just show you one of the three. This is a reminder that our factory objects, our factory types need registering in DI. We're going to use dependency injection in order to create them automatically within our user interface, or in this case, it's within our MVVM, our view model. So I always forget to do this manual registration. And so what I've done is I've created a little package which allows me to do automatic registration. Now, have a look on NuGet and on the project the website on GitHub. I explain why I do it rather than use an existing one, because I would much rather use an existing package. The problem with the existing packages is that they will register anything anywhere within the solution, and they do it based on interfaces usually rather than strict typing. And so that's a security concern. If you are going to reflect across every single assembly that's in your bin folder, that will include NuGet packages. And so some NuGet packages would have DI stuff registered into your container. I'm not very happy with that. So what this one does is it allows me to say it only works on the current assembly, or you can specify an assembly and do it from outside of that assembly if you want to. But it's just a bit of control to say I don't want to register types from anywhere. I want to register types that are in my assembly, and I want to do it by name. I want to use a thing called convention over configuration. So by convention, all of my factory objects are called factory, and they are nested within the type that they apply to. So if I just reflect over and find everything called factory and register that into DI, that's a pretty good, easy way to do it. So this to do down here is to remind you that if you create anything that doesn't fit that naming convention, that you would have to register it manually. And I'm going to leave it there because that continues to be true throughout the life of the project. Now, you don't have to leave it there if you don't want to. You can take it away and just know that your system will crash if you don't hit the naming convention. And that includes things like typos. So I'm leaving it there. You can do whatever with it that you like, but that exists in 3 levels. So it exists in the objects project. That the objects projects are where the factories are, and so some reflection needs to happen over that assembly to register the factory types. It exists in the repository implementation layer because the implementation of our repositories needs to be added to DI as well, so that they can work with the inject attributes that CSLA uses. It also works with view models. So what I have my system doing is that my Blazor components ask for the view models to be injected into them, and the view model then asks for everything else to be injected into it, is the way I do it. So that's what those 3 registrations are, so I'm going to leave those there. There's one more that we will look at momentarily, quickly, which is within the unit tests, which I said I wasn't going to do anything with, but I'll just show you what this is about. some of the tests that I automatically generate require that the model is valid so that it will save in order for the test to pass. So at this point, what we would do is we would look at the properties of our model and see what has a required attribute against it, and then set some sort of default text in the unit test project that would make it valid. So we'll just call it project 1 maybe. So I think the name is the only thing that's required. I think I said that description was optional. And so we wouldn't need to set that here. The 2 dates started and ended are optional. And so I think the only thing we need to set in this particular case is the name. But anything with a required attribute against it, or anything which would fail validation for any reason because of the automatically generated or the rules that you add, you need to change this method within the test in order to make it pass, so that some of the tests that I've generated will work, or delete those tests, whichever you prefer. If those tests are not useful to you, then of course don't use them. There's one final reminder, which is that we are adding a fake authentication mechanism to allow us to do testing of authorization rules. It is entirely fake and it should never be used in production. So there's a to-do about that. Some later task within your task list of building your system would be to determine what's going on with authentication, whether you add an authentication system or whether you're working in a system which is public and requires no authentication, in which case there should be no authorization rules on any of your classes that you're trying to access. So you would delete the authorization rules. So again, I'm going to leave that there because that is still valid. So at this point, we've dealt with our task list, and we should be able to start building our projects and see whether they build. So we'll start with the objects project and see whether that builds. It may not. No, it doesn't. So a child object, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, a child object needs to know the ID of its parent when it's saved. And it also needs to know the ID of its parent when it's retrieving the subset of children associated with the parent. So the contract for the repository needs to be different for a child than it does for a root object. And in my code, I don't handle that automatically at the moment. So I expect you to find this problem and fix it manually. So I've changed the interface that is associated with the repository of the child object. Now I'm going to go to the implementation. The implementation is the Visual Studio bit. So that has managed to get a bit closer. Or has it? It's done it on the individual item. No, it hasn't now. So we need to do the same thing here. And then because we need to pass that to our store procedure, we would need to change the code to add that as a parameter. That gets passed down. And similarly, this problem also exists within the store procedure, which is defined within our data storage project, although we can't see it yet. So the data storage project, as I mentioned, it doesn't use a thing called globbing, which is what the SDK style projects do now in .NET Core and beyond. So they automatically know what files are underneath them and include them in the project, whereas this one is a .NET framework using the old project style, the messy one. If you look at it, it's horrendous. So what we need to do is we need to manually add files to this. So what I did there, just to talk you through, was I click Show All Files within Visual Studio Solution Explorer. That shows me everything, and they're grayed out if they're not included in the project. So now I can see that my stored procedures need to be selected and then choose Include in Project. Similarly, my tables, Include in Project, and the security role. Don't miss the security role. It sort of sits on its own in this solution. Don't miss that one, otherwise your security won't work quite as you intended. But we don't need anything else. So with that done, we can turn off Show All Files again so that we don't see the Obj project and that sort of thing. But where we were going was to change SP assignment list fetch. This is for listing a root object. And is therefore not suitable for use for getting a child collection. So we need to change this. To make use of the project ID that's being passed. So that should be, that should now make this stored procedure compatible with the change that we made to the repository implementation. Let's get back to our list and see how we're getting on. So we're missing some namespaces in our unit tests. I'm surprised that matters because I didn't ask that to build. Just sort out these namespaces. Come on. So the problem here is that the fake navigator that gets code generated and put into our test project needs to have a namespace imported because it doesn't know the name of the project it's within. So that's why that one looks a bit odd and you don't get a fix for it. And then you can see that I'm referring to a type which doesn't exist, which is the fake project repository that you would need to create in order to get your unit tests to work. And then it will complain that it doesn't implement the necessary interface. For which we need a namespace. And then this will complain that it's not implemented. And we would do a very basic implementation of this. I think I will skip that because this video will get a bit long, but this is really, really simple to implement a fake. You're just going to return, well, let me do one just to show you. So for delete async, what we would need to do is return a task. So we pretend that delete works and we don't do anything. We do that just by task.completedTask. And in fetch, we use task.fromResult and we create a new project DTO. And we specify as part of it that its ID is the value that's been provided. Our list, we would return task.fromResult of a new list of project DTO with no items in. I mean, you can add items to it if you want to, but I don't tend to. The only thing is we need to cast this to iList of project DTO, because for whatever reason that one doesn't happen automatically. task.from result can't work that out for some reason. Insert async, we would do task.from results of the data that's provided, the object that's provided. So what insert and update allow you to do is update values like values that are generated by the database or managed by the database, like the IDs. So they get passed in and then they get passed back out again with any updates being applied, and we don't need to change them. So that's an implementation just to show you what one would look like. We would need one for the other repository as well, which I won't do. So are we at a point now where our objects project will build? Yes, that builds. So the one above it is data accessed in terms of the references. See if that builds. Yeah, that one's good. The one that makes use of the objects project is UI control. So that should build now. What I haven't done is set a namespace in the web UI, have I? I don't think I did this. So in our imports Razor, we need to add using statements for the objects project and the MVVM UI control layer. Otherwise that wouldn't work. Now this will, so our UI control layer I think built. Did it? Yes, so that one built. This one probably won't, and it's worth me showing you that it doesn't and what happens when it doesn't, because it's a bit weird. So sometimes you get absolutely no help at all here. There's actually two reasons why it's failing, and this one gives you an error message. So what I'll do is I'll show you this one first, and then I'll show you it failing again, because the other one is more weird. So within our edit UI, what it's tried to do is it's tried to create some markup for binding all of the properties of the object to the user interface. Two of them are date time types, the started and ended types. And so binding to a text input, an input text component, doesn't work. And the error message that you get is not all that obvious because it refers to the code generated file. So if you know Blazor, then you might recognize that. If you don't, then it might be that what you're trying to do is bind to the wrong type of input control. So there are date time input controls, but I'm not going to worry about fixing the user interface as I mentioned earlier. I just need it to build. So at this point we do this and we should find it still doesn't build, and this time we won't get an error message, which is why I want to show you this. Or at least we won't get an error message about this particular problem. So it says rebuild all failed, and it doesn't open the error list, which is a bit confusing. If I open the error list, there are no errors in it, as if it should have built, and it didn't build. And again, this is a little bit of a Blazor peculiarity. Even in .NET 6 and the latest version of Visual Studio, this is still happening, which is a shame. So I'll tell you what it is, and that's why I did it. In our list component, which is auto-generated for us, I make a complete guess. It's just sort of hard-coded about what you might want to put on the list. And what it does is it uses the naming convention that I talked about, where the naming convention for the ID and the name of a table, as I would create them, and the object that comes over it, if that's the case, I normally include the name of the object. So instead of calling it name, I call it project name. And instead of calling it ID, I call it project ID. So this bit of the DesiGen templates is sort of a bit rough and ready, hard-coded to guess that you might want to put a thing called the name of the artifact plus the word name on the end. So that's an imperfection in the generated code. And so if you get these sort of errors where the Blazor bit won't build, but it doesn't give you an error message, just open the Blazor components and it will tell you what the problem is as soon as you do that, because it goes, oh yeah, this is the thing that you need to know about once the editor sort of fired up. So that should solve our problem for us in our Blazor layer. And hopefully this time it should build. So we're getting close now. The next bit to do is that our data storage project defines a SQL Server database, but it's only a definition of one. It isn't actually a SQL Server database. So what we need to do is we need to publish this project. What that will do for us is create us a database and set the schema up that is necessary. So I choose any old random connection on my local dev database instance, and then I change the database name to be what I want it to be, because what choosing one has done is set up the connection string, of course. And then I save this profile just with the default name so that I can reuse it in the future and I don't have to manually pick it again. So that will create a database called Project Tracker on our local instance. And if we click publish, this can sometimes run a little bit slowly. So I'll come back to you in a second once this is finished on the assumption that it'll be a bit slow. In the meantime, it does give me a moment to tell you that there are a couple of other problems with the code that we've generated, and they're particularly to do with the datetime data type. So we have started and ended properties, and they are passing through our repository and into the database. And they are optional, so they're not always set to something very sensible. And we're going to have to do a little bit of work in the repository to fix that. There is actually something else we need to fix. So what I've done is I've shown you the default kind of code generation. The default code generation includes some validation rules that I choose by default. And I can't remember if I said it in this tutorial, but I have said it in a couple of others, that what I do is I generate the most secure thing that I possibly can and encourage you to think about it as a result of the problems that may arise. So we'll come back to that point because I want to show you what happens in the UI first when that problem exists. The good news is this ran nice and quickly. It's created our Project Tracker database. It's pushed all our stored procedures and our tables to it. I'm running under my own sort of user credentials here. So the only bit it hasn't done is set up a user that would have the right permissions in the database. Because it's going to run as me, it will run with all permissions, which is not very good. If you've seen my video earlier in the day about the principle of least privilege, that's not good really, but it's helpful for development, but you shouldn't ever do it beyond development. In development, it's quite handy so that this kind of stuff works. The publishing of the schema changes would all work for you. Okay, so at this point, we should have a system which will fire up. But as I say, there are a couple of problems, and I'll show you what the problems are first, and then I'll fix them. Well, let's fire it up and see how it's looking. When it fires up, it'll take a moment to open a browser window. I've opened it with debugging, which I needn't have done, but not to worry. When it fires up the browser window, what we see is a default home screen, effectively, that I've created for you. That's it's got no links to anything. So it doesn't have a link to the things that we added. That would require changing an item that's generated rather than overwriting it, which desigen doesn't do. It only overwrites a whole file. So I can't do that, but the good news is that an endpoint will exist for us based on the name of the structure that the list was based upon, is what I'm trying to get to. So we go there and it says you are not authorized, and that's not a great surprise. So the reason for that is, as I mentioned, we've got fake authentication stuff going on here, and the fake thing just gives the user membership, like a default membership of users, because that's the sort of thing that I would normally do, you know, in a demo. That's no good for this project because our roles are called project manager and administrator. Now, it doesn't make sense to be in both of those. You should be in either one or other. Just to show you all the working code, I'm going to add myself to both. But what you should really do is comment one or other of these out when you're doing your testing, your real world testing, or get to the point where you're actually adding a real authentication system which allows you to log in. So we'll fire it up again and see how it goes. Need to do the switch of URL again. You can obviously just change the navigator and add something to it. So it looks like it's working in the sense that it's shown us that the project's table is empty. We should be able to add a project, and this is where we find our next problem. So the name is going to be project 1. Why not? Hello, my typing's gone all awry. So at this point, we get this strange object reference not set to an instance of an object error message. So as if something in the background is not working, and that's pretty fair because that's exactly what's going on, except it's not inside of our solution that's not working. So let me show you what's going on. I'm just going to take a quick break. I'll be back with you in a moment. Okay, sorry about that. That was just a quick sup of my drink, sorting out a couple of little bits. So what I was going to talk about was the reason that that error message came up. So let's have a look at our editable object. As I mentioned while the database was building, so I create you a bunch of default stuff as a best guess of the sort of thing that you might need to do in terms of validation. So if the little tick box on a field is marked as required, then I put a required attribute against the field. I set the maximum length based upon how big the field is in the data structure that we did, and I add an extra validation. And the reason that I did some videos earlier about security was for exactly this reason that I need to talk to you about this. It is a defense in depth measure that you do character set validation for things like cross-site scripting and SQL injection. You should not be accepting anything that a user types in most systems, in pretty much all systems to be fair. Now Blazor is protected against cross-site scripting fairly well. Even so, I would still do validation here. What I do is I generate code with the sort of the strictest that I think you might get away with, and then you can change it to be a bit more liberal in terms of what's accepted. Now in a project name, having only alphanumeric characters might be insufficient. You might need some things more than that, in which case you can choose one of the other validation rules that's available for you. Latin free text is fairly lax in terms of what it's doing, but it's not that it's doing nothing. So the code behind this is actually doing two checks. It's checking an allowed list and it's checking a blocked list. So even changing it to something called free text makes it sound as though it'll do anything. Actually, the word Latin gives away that it won't. It won't accept things like Cyrillic characters. It's only the Latin alphabet. So this covers sort of Europe, but may not cover Eastern Europe and places further east than that, for example. You may need to create your own validation rule for that. This is an extensible little system, so you can create your own validation rules. You have to create a repository with your rules in. But what this actually accepts, this character set attribute, is a string. It looks like it's an enum, but it's not. It's just a string, and I've got a class with some constants on it, which allow me to choose anything. But you can put your own names in here. So you can put any rule that you want as long as your repository understands what that rule name is. So if I changed it to free text, that would be a bit freer. But the problem here is actually that the character set attribute, the data annotations system behind this, is not working. This is a limitation with CSLA 6.0.0, that it doesn't support data annotations rules that use dependency injection under the covers. CSLA 6 is obviously using DI much more heavily, and so I changed my code thinking that it would just work with DI, and it turns out that for data annotation rules it doesn't, not in the very first release, CSLA 6.0.0. The fix for that was very easy and has already been submitted and accepted and merged into main. So the next build that gets released of CSLA, this problem will be fixed. But for now, this character set validation basically won't work with CSLA. So what we do is we just comment it out. You will often need to change the rule that's being used to be more forgiving in the characters that are being entered. Sometimes it will be less forgiving. Sometimes if you wanted a textual input of a phone number, you might use one of the phone number ones, which really restricts the characters that can be used. But sometimes you'll want more permissive validation rules, but generally having the validation rules there is a good idea. And that's why I'm commenting them out rather than removing them, because at a future point it would be sensible to come back and add these back in as soon as CSLA supports the way this works. So putting a to-do to remind you that you've commented them out might be a sensible thing to do here. I'm not going to, because this is getting a bit long, this tutorial. So let's try and whip through to the end. Now, when I fire it up, what I should get is a new browser window, which I'll have to change the URL on again. And this time when we add a project, we should find that it saves. Oh, and it doesn't save. I love it when a plan comes together. Okay, let me see if I can debug what the problem is. Live in front of you. My word, what a big big error message. Okay, so this is the other problem that I mentioned. Yeah, I'd forgotten about this bit. So our repository is trying to write datetime.min value into the database. And the database is going, oh no, I don't like that. Despite the fact that I've used datetime2, which does confuse me very slightly, but let's not dwell on that. Let's just fix it. So in our repository implementation, which is up here somewhere, in project repository, within our method that writes our DTO back into parameters within the stored procedure, we've got to handle the fact that these two properties might not have valid values. So we just add a little expression here to check that. And if it's set to min value, then rather than pass the value that we had, we need to pass dbnull.value, because we don't want to store some strange value. We just want to store a null. So we're going to have an else, and we're going to copy that for ended as well, so that if ended is null, we do the same thing. Should sort that out, and it's this one here. dbNull value is what we want to set, and this time that is if it's ended is datetime min value. I did do equals, that might be better, but this will do. This should work. So if ended is set to min value, in other words, it doesn't have a very valid value, then write dbNull. I'm not using the smart datetime in this demo. I've sort of switched away from smart datetime a little bit, and maybe I should have changed this over. I can't remember whether Project Tracker uses smart datetime, but it probably does. And so it might have been better for me to change the data type. But I don't have default handling for it in my templates because it's not one that I use myself anymore. Let's see if that solves this problem. Yeah, so we can now add projects to our heart's content. And they should save to the database. When we edit one, we should see that the updates are saving, and we should be able to delete them. Delete only works because I'm a member of both roles, project managers and administrators. The rules in Project Tracker, I think, say that project managers have to create and administrators have to delete, I think. There's a specialization, and what we would have to do is update our user interface so that our delete button is not enabled if we're in the wrong role, and it doesn't do that by default. So perhaps it should, but at the moment this template doesn't do that. So that's a change that we would have to make in the user interface. But that is the end of our tutorial. So we've done a bit of Project Tracker. Now we've created a root object, a root editable, with a child collection and a child underneath it, but we haven't actually used the child, and the child probably wouldn't work without a few tiny tweaks. But more importantly, the child actually needs quite a lot of customization in order to do what Project Tracker does. So that is left to you to have a think about. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea of how to use Desigen to do a little bit of Project Tracker. There was a little bit of CSLA special stuff in there really, and a little bit of fixes to one or two things. Remember the change to the repository for a child collection. Temporarily the character set validator isn't working, unfortunately, but as soon as we have a new build of CSLA, that will work. That's true of a couple of other little things as well. You would notice that in the background, the repository throws an exception when it's trying to be disposed, and that's because CSLA also doesn't yet support async dispose object types, which I've used on the connection manager, which I've built in order to make CSLA 6 work for the time being. The connection manager is maybe something that we won't use long term, but it was something that I needed short term in order to just get the templates working so that I could get them out to you. but it's throwing an exception, and that's because CSLA doesn't support iAsync disposable. Hopefully the next build will. I saw Rocky update a discussion in the CSLA GitHub repo yesterday, saying that he hopes to get that in shortly. That's one I haven't been able to offer to do myself, that one, because I've had a bunch of other things going on, particularly getting these templates done, because I wanted to get support for CSLA 6 into DesiGen, and it's now there, and I hope you appreciate it. So remember, you can go to getdesigning.dotnotstandard.com for information about design. That site includes a link to the docs site for the DesiGen tool. Follow that link. That will take you to where you can download it and install it yourself and give it a go. So there will be other videos on DesiGen, so stay tuned for more. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll join me again soon.